So I actually brought up the slides from the previous session. So once again, like the word sprite is kind of like any object generally, like any sort of um object that you would have in a game, and specifically Pygame sprites are basically like a pre-built class that make it easier to add like different sorts of attributes to your objects. So like, sound, images, be animations, behaviors. And once again, kind of went over this before. But they have two pretty important properties, which are the image and the rectangle, which will be used for collisions. And then we have the draw and update methods. Okay, that's a review. So now we'll be covering physics, which it's basically like the movement of objects within your game, right? So I'm guessing most of you are in high school, so you probably have had some exposure to so-called physics already, but in game physics, generally, we are not going to go so much into the actual mathematics, and it's more like, how can we make our game like look better? So, um, some examples of that include like gravity, projectiles, collisions. I would say in most 2D games, people generally don't add like, curving shots or stuff, but you can if you want. Mm, yeah, so one of the things that you'll see pretty often in pretty much every single game with movement is speed or velocity. So like velocity, generally we call it velocity if it has like a direction. Speed is like no direction. And usually there we assign a value to velocity, which allows you to just like update your position with a constant velocity instead of having to like make that, sorry, um decide that like every single time, right? So here you can see we're using variables. And the other cool thing about velocity is you can add acceleration. So acceleration is like if the velocity is kind of constantly changing. So you can see here instead of like traveling at a constant velocity, the ball speeds up over time. And that how that works is we basically increment the velocity, I'm going to call it velocity, by gravity, which it's a fixed value, and as you can see, the ball speeds up. So with that done, we have our first quick question. Okay. Yeah, hopefully that wasn't too hard for everyone. Um, yeah, so main thing is you just want to be, oops, you just want to be changing the speed by gravity, kind of like we saw in a previous slide. Mm, yeah, hopefully that makes sense to everyone. If it doesn't, you can always kind of like look it up or just experiment with on your own. But mm, so one of the things that you can use acceleration for, especially like if you implement gravity into your game, then it makes like jumping, well, a lot more easy. And so how this works is you kind of just like when somebody presses the jump key, you can set the oh yeah, what sorry. one more thing, like you want to remember that like the further down you go to the screen, like the greater the y value is. When you move to the right, the greater x value is. So when you want to jump, you actually want to set the y speed to a negative value. And um what that does is like now the character's got an upward velocity. And it kind of works out with the gravity because as the character's going up, as you can see kind of in this diagram, they slow down, but since the velocity is still in the upward direction, then the character is still going up while at the top. Then finally, like the acceleration is still acting on the velocity, right? So now the velocity becomes positive again, and the character comes back down. And obviously, you will have like a collision down here, which would detect when it hits the ground, and then yeah. Mm. So kind of like what I was saying is what we do is we add a, some sort of key to sense when somebody wants to jump, and you basically set the y speed to what is the so-called jump velocity. So like depending on how high you want the character to jump, you would set this like greater negative number if you want them to go more, or lower if you want them to jump less. Mm, what else? Yeah, so that actually brings us to our next exercise, which you kind of want to use the concepts of velocity and acceleration that we went over before, and just make this bird jump when you press like, I guess this, it doesn't really matter what key, but you want a key that makes the bird jump when you press on it, and then when you're not pressing on it, it just drops to the ground. And then there's actually three bonuses. The third one is to add like a terminal velocity, and then the other two you can see on the slide. So let's see. I think we can do 15 minutes for this exercise. Hopefully it should be enough because it's not too much to implement, and you can kind of like reference these slides here if you get stuck. Um, great. Oh yeah, so here's like I just put a template in the chat because I know some people mentioned they kind of had to restart some of the code. Okay, 1 second. So, um, I am sure. Okay, so next up we have collisions, and basically collisions are when two sprites overlap. So, and usually when we have collisions, like something happens, right? So it's like when a player hits a platform, the player stops falling. When the bullet hits an enemy, it kills the enemy. Mm, so there's like a bunch of examples for this. The ones that are mentioned, it's like when Mario, I'm gonna assume you guys have played Mario. I actually haven't, but I'm just gonna trust that. So yeah, when Mario collides with a mushroom, he grows bigger. I think I've heard something about that. And when he collides with like floor and stuff, like every single, um, like anything that stops a character from moving, like that's obviously collision. And there's like other stuff like, bullets. Um, and kind of like a good question to keep in mind. I mean, you kind of figure this out as you code a game. It's like what other things are collisions like used for, right? Uh there's this is not like the greatest example, but technically when you press buttons with your mouse, it can be, you can actually use it as a form of collision. So what the Pygame function, like when you want to have, if you have like a menu screen, for example, there's actually something called like collide point, which instead of like checking for two rectangles, it's just like, is this point within the rectangle, right? Is the point overlapping? And that's how you can detect like, is the mouse, basically check first of all, is there a mouse click? And two, is the mouse actually like within the button? And that's how menu screens work. Um, so Pygame has like a really useful built-in collision function. By the way, the collision code without like built-in collision functions is like probably like 50 lines of code on its own. It's just tedious. It's not necessarily complicated. If you're curious, I can put some resources into the probably like the Wednesday slides or something, not Wednesday slides, those Discord server on like, exactly how the collision function is built up. Okay, I guess I can go over it kind of now, but basically you check like, for example, is the left side of this rectangle within the left and right boundaries of this other rectangle, and then you check like you do the same thing for the y coordinates, right? You use like a bunch of logic from scratch, you build it up, and then that's how you have a collision function. Mm, but hey, we have a built-in function, so basically it returns you true or false, and you can use that for a bunch of useful things. A quick thing I will note is this one, it only returns like whether a collision is happening or not. So sometimes if you have like, for example, let's say you're doing like a 2D game from bird's eye view and you have like a character moving around, you still have to check like what direction the character, or I guess a better example is actually a platformer because this is kind of an issue you will probably run into during your game. It's like you have to check which direction the character actually collided into the platform from, because you might have like, I'm not sure if I can illustrate it. I'll try. Okay, so this say this character is like jumping, right? And if you hit it like over here, you have to be like, okay, well it's colliding from the right side. So that way it should actually fall down. But if you only have like, for example, top collision, or like you don't if you have to check like logic, right? You have to use logic to check, and it's a bit of work. Otherwise, like if you only have top collision, for example, it'd be like, oh look, these two collided. Therefore, let's teleport the bottom of the player to the top of this platform. And that's kind of what we're gonna do for our exercise this session, but it's also worth like figuring out what to do when you have bottom collisions left, right. So like yeah, this doesn't remove all the work. So the simplest example is basically if a player is collided with the platform, change the Y speed to 0, and obviously once again, like let's say the player was like touch the edge of the platform. That's still a collision, but you don't want the player to like stop moving on the edge of the platform, right? So that's you kind of have to figure that out later. So yeah, second quick question actually, like if the enemy and the wall are sprites, right? Then what does the collision do? And yeah, I guess the other thing you want to keep in mind is actually no, Pygame.sprite.collide rect just takes in like two rectangles, so you can actually technically you can enter them like you could just enter the numbers yourself. Sometimes you might want to create a rectangle on the spot. Or there's like a useful variation of this, which you have. No, I won't go into that now, but I will send a link in the Discord. There's just a different way of detecting collisions where you kind of like portray where the object is going to be. So it'd be like, okay, the rectangle is um position X plus, X velocity, Y plus Y velocity, and the way that the reason that's like good is that way like you instead of waiting for the collision to happen, you see first if it's going to collide, and then you adjust the speed before it collides. Whereas if it's already collided, then you have to like figure out which direction it's collided from. If that doesn't make sense, once again, I'll probably just send a link in the Discord. Yeah, so we have a quick question. Okay, so for this one, it's and I guess we are assuming like a few things like, oh yeah, enemy actually exists. Basically, it's saying if the enemy collides with a wall, then it's just gonna change its X direction. Um, sorry, yeah. So maybe if like the character hits this way, right, then it's just gonna go backward. If you have it like landing, maybe it's coming out at a weird angle and it collides and it had like an X velocity in the right, then it'll start moving left. Um, and it doesn't actually have to be for a fixed platform. Like maybe there's no Y collision built in, so it just like it hits it, starts moving to the left. Um, I guess like if you didn't have like Y collision and this sort of code was running, what we'd actually have is you'd probably have like the character kind of get stuck moving left and right because it would keep on the collision would keep on registering. Um, yeah. Oh dear. Okay. Yeah, so one of the ways, like how you check for multiple collisions, you just use like the Pygame group thing. So, blah.
For sure.
Basically you do like platforms equal Pygame.sprite.group if you remember from previous slide. And the group is kind of like a fancy list because it is kind of just a list with all the platforms, but you can call like certain functions on it. For example, like update and I think there's actually a built-in like you can just check for collisions between one object and every single entity in a group, but the what is it called? Without the functions, like built-in functions, then this is how you would do it, right? Like for every object within a group, like check for collision. Um, other thing you can do is there's like a sprite.kill function, which basically um hmm, I'm pretty sure it just removes like the object. It just deletes the object, which obviously you don't. I mean, I would probably not run like player.kill. I just like run it like a game over command or something. And like, yeah, so here's a question for thought. I'm just gonna answer for y'all. Like the coin gets deleted. Um, and okay, hopefully, this time we ran through pretty fast. So the exercise is gonna be adding basically
Ryan,
collision
I don't
for.
your screen
Oh,
sharing.
that's silly. Haha. Um, great. Yeah, I guess if you guys were following through like on the slides itself, that would be nice, but um where did I leave it? Yeah, after this, um basically it's the how you create a group is you use this function, the built-in function, and what else? Yeah, I don't think I showed anything else. It's kind of just like moving the player around. I was like, okay, if you collide here, right, for this quick question, then it just it's saying the direction reverses, right? Oops. And yeah, so in this one, I'm pretty sure what we want is just like top bottom collision. We don't really, if you want to try, you can also add like collision in every single direction. Um, it is like trickier, so you'll probably want to ask your mentors for help if you get stuck. Other couple bonuses, like you kind of want to like pull some of your Flappy Bird, assuming you manage to finish it, you want to pull some of your like Flappy Bird code over to this project so that makes it easier. So yeah, you don't want the people to jump if they're in midair, and then you can add like a new sprite that kills a player if it touches it. Mm, okay. Just gonna check. So optionally, you can also use like this platform.py file. You don't actually have to use it. Uh, I think it just saves like a bit of time, but it's also if you how do I say this? If you already have like some sort of code on your own, like you can just use that instead. Because I think Well, the platform.py file, just like look through it and then make sure you understand it. If you're gonna use it, like if you don't understand it, like maybe try recreating it on your own first. And yeah, that's about it. And yeah, okay, one last thing. Like, if you use this platform file, like rename it to something other than platform.py because platform.py is actually like an existing Python library or something. So you will have like issues with your code if you just name it platform.py. And yeah, so I guess we just have like basically the rest of session. Good luck.